We don't serve your type here. People like you just waste our time. That's what Preston Crownley told Corporal Tristan Beckford while the soldier stood in full Queen's Guard uniform before having him thrown out of the dealership. As Beckford reached the door, Crownley added with a smirk, "If you've got a problem, go cry to your precious prince." 24 hours later, that's exactly what happened, and the person who walked into the showroom next left everyone frozen in disbelief. Before we reveal what happened next, be sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished marble floor of Crownline Motors, one of London's most prestigious luxury car dealerships. The showroom gleamed with the kind of wealth that most people only dreamed of touching. Vintage Jaguars, pristine Bentleys, and rare Aston Martins sat like crown jewels under the carefully positioned spotlights. The air carried the scent of leather conditioner and expensive cologne, mixed with the quiet murmur of wealthy clients discussing their next automotive acquisition. It was into this temple of automotive luxury that Corporal Tristan Beckford stepped that Tuesday morning in November. His scarlet tunic was immaculate, every brass button polished to mirror perfection. The famous bearskin hat sat precisely positioned on his head, and his ceremonial bayonet gleamed at his side. The Queen's Guard uniform commanded respect wherever it appeared, a symbol of centuries of tradition and unwavering duty to the crown. The moment Beckford crossed the threshold, conversations stopped, heads turned. A well-dressed woman near a vintage Rolls-Royce actually gasped, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. Someone's iPhone appeared, camera clicking rapidly. The reaction was predictable, but unfortunate to most of these people. He looked like a tourist attraction, a living postcard they could photograph and forget. But Beckford had grown accustomed to the stares. What he hadn't expected was the particular mix of disdain and amusement in the eyes of the young man approaching him from behind the mahogany service desk. Preston Crownley, heir to the Crownline fortune, moved with the practiced arrogance of someone who had never been told no, never faced real consequences for his actions. Preston's suit probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. His shoes were handmade Italian leather, his watch a limited edition Patek Philippe. Everything about him screamed money, but not the kind that came with class or earned respect. This was inherited wealth, the kind that made young men believe they were superior simply by accident of birth. Beckford's attention, however, was drawn to something far more beautiful than Preston's expensive accessories. There, positioned under a perfect cone of light, sat in 1964 Jaguar E-Type in British racing green. The car was absolutely magnificent, every curve flowing like liquid metal, the chrome bumpers reflecting the showroom lights like mirrors. This wasn't just a car, it was art, engineering, poetry made manifest in steel and leather. His grandfather would have loved this machine. Thomas Beckford had spent 30 years of his life restoring classic Jaguars in a small garage in Yorkshire, teaching young Tristan everything he knew about engines, about craftsmanship, about the difference between mass production and true artistry. The old man had died when Tristan was 18, leaving behind a workshop full of tools and a head full of knowledge that most people assumed a Queen's Guard wouldn't possess. As Beckford approached the E-Type, his trained eye immediately began cataloguing details. The paint was perfect, obviously a recent restoration. The interior leather looked original but beautifully maintained. But something wasn't quite right about the engine bay. Through the slightly raised hood, he could see the intake manifold, and unless he was very much mistaken, it had been replaced with a modern reproduction. His gloved hand hovered over the door handle, not quite touching but close enough to examine the craftsmanship of the restoration. That's when Preston's voice cut through the showroom's refined atmosphere like a rusty blade. "Don't touch what you can't afford, tin soldier." The words carried across the marble floor, causing several conversations to pause mid-sentence. A young saleswoman named Rebecca, who had been approaching to offer assistance, stopped in her tracks, her face flushing with embarrassment. She had worked at Crownline for 3 years and had never heard a customer addressed so rudely, especially not someone in military uniform. But Beckford didn't flinch. His grandfather had taught him that knowledge was power, and power was best displayed quietly, with confidence rather than bluster. He straightened slightly, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who knew exactly what he was talking about. Mars gearbox, 265 horsepower, and this intake manifold, he said, lightly tapping the hood with one gloved finger. "Not original. My grandfather restored these for 30 years. The technical accuracy of his observation hung in the air, like a challenge. Near the Bentley display, Sir Charles Wellington, a distinguished gentleman in his 70s who had been collecting Jaguars longer than Preston had been alive, raised an eyebrow with interest. Wellington had built his fortune in manufacturing, but his true passion was classic cars, and he could spot expertise from across a room. Preston's face darkened like a storm cloud. The idea that this costumed tourist could know more about his merchandise than he did was unthinkable. In his world, people in uniforms were there to serve people in expensive suits, not to lecture them about automotive history. "I think you've confused this showroom with the Tower of London," Preston said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We don't do tourist photos here, and we certainly don't need automotive advice from someone who gets around on foot." Rebecca stepped forward, her professional instincts overriding her shock. "Sir, I'd be happy to show you our." Preston waved her off with the casual dismissal of someone who had never learned to respect working people. "I'll handle this, Rebecca. Our friend here clearly wandered in from the wrong century." The insult rippled through the showroom. Several customers had stopped their own conversations to watch the confrontation unfold. This was better than theatre, a real-life drama playing out among the chrome and leather. But Beckford's expression remained perfectly neutral. In his line of work, maintaining composure under pressure wasn't just important, it was literally a matter of life and death. He had stood motionless for hours in all weather, had faced down aggressive tourists, hostile protesters, and even genuine threats without so much as blinking. A spoiled rich boy with more money than sense was hardly going to break his professional demeanor. "The E-Type is a remarkable machine," Beckford continued, as if Preston hadn't spoken. "Sir William Lyon's masterpiece, though I notice the asking price doesn't mention the non-original components. Collectors can be particular about authenticity." Sir Charles Wellington couldn't suppress a small smile. The young man in the uniform clearly knew his automobiles, and Preston's face was turning an interesting shade of red that clashed terribly with his expensive tie. Preston's patience, never his strongest virtue, finally snapped completely. He gestured sharply toward the showroom's security guard, a large man named Davies, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort. "Escort this performer out," Preston commanded, his voice carrying across the marble floor. "Though do tell your precious prince we said hello." The last words were delivered with such sneering contempt that even the most privileged customers in the showroom felt uncomfortable. There was something deeply unseemly about mocking someone's military service, regardless of the circumstances. Davies approached reluctantly. He was a former military man himself, and everything about Beckford's bearing suggested this was no tourist in a costume. The uniform was perfect, the posture unmistakably military, the calm professionalism, exactly what you'd expect from someone who had earned the right to guard the royal family. "Sir," Davies said quietly, "I think there might be a misunderstanding here." "No misunderstanding," Preston snapped. "Just a tourist who's overstayed his welcome." As Davies reluctantly began to escort Beckford toward the door, the guard's eyes locked onto the E-Type one last time. His hand moved unconsciously to his pocket, where he kept a faded photograph, his grandfather standing beside an identical car, tools in hand, grease under his fingernails, the pride of honest work shining in his eyes. The photo had been taken in 1987, the day Thomas Beckford had completed his masterpiece, restoration of a 1964 E-Type, for a wealthy collector. The old man had spent 18 months on that car, every spare hour after his regular job at the factory, working by lamplight in his tiny garage. When it was finished, it had been perfect, more beautiful than the day it rolled off the production line. That evening, Wellington Barracks buzzed with the quiet efficiency of military life. Soldiers cleaned equipment, studied regulations, and prepared for the next day's duties. In his small but meticulously organized room, Beckford sat at his desk, still in uniform, carefully documenting the day's incident in his official report. Major Whitfield, a career officer with 25 years of service, read the report with growing astonishment. As Beckford's commanding officer, he had seen plenty of civilian complaints about the guards, usually tourists upset about not getting photos or responses to their questions. But this was different. This was about respect, about the honor of the uniform, about the very principles the guards were sworn to uphold. He said, "What about the uniform?" Whitfield's voice carried the dangerous quiet of a professional soldier. who had just heard something that challenged everything he believed. In the Major's mind immediately went to the previous month's incident at the Children's Hospital. Prince William had been making a routine visit, opening a new wing dedicated to pediatric cancer treatment. The event had been carefully planned, security thoroughly vetted, press credentials checked and double-checked. It should have been a simple, joyful occasion, but in the crowd of photographers and reporters, something had felt wrong to Beckford. Call it instinct, training, or simply the heightened awareness that comes from years of standing guard over the royal family. One man in the press group moved differently, his eyes scanning not for the perfect shot, but for something else entirely. When the man reached inside his jacket, Beckford didn't hesitate. His movement was so subtle, so professional, that most people didn't even notice it happen. A gentle step forward, a courteous touch on the shoulder, a quiet word about press positioning. To everyone else, it looked like routine crowd management. The knife was discovered later, concealed in a modified camera case. The photographer turned out to be a disturbed individual with a history of threats against the royal family. His plan had been simple and deadly. Get close during the photo, opportunity, strike quickly, and disappear in the chaos that would follow. Beckford's intervention had saved Prince William's life, possibly prevented a national tragedy. But in the way of the guards, the incident had been handled quietly, professionally, without fanfare or public recognition. The royal family knew what had happened, as did the security services, but to the public, it was just another successful royal visit. That was the way Beckford preferred it. He hadn't joined the guards for glory or recognition. He had joined to serve, to stand between the crown and those who would do it harm. The uniform he wore wasn't a costume or a tourist attraction. It was a sacred trust, a symbol of duty that stretched back through centuries of British history. Major Whitfield set down the report and reached for his secure phone. This wasn't just about a rude car dealer anymore. This was about respect for the uniform, for the service, for the very institution they had sworn to protect. The palace would want to hear about this, and Whitfield suspected they would want to do something about it. As he dialed, Whitfield couldn't help but think about the irony. Preston Crownley had told Beckford to complain to his prince. Perhaps it was time to take him up on that suggestion. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Kensington Palace, Private Secretary's office. This is Major Whitfield, Welsh Guards. I need to speak with someone about an incident involving one of my men and a member of the public. I believe His Royal Highness will want to be informed. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, typical London autumn weather that made the city's architecture look particularly majestic. At Crown Line Motors, the staff arrived to find something extraordinary waiting for them. The showroom had been transformed overnight. Rose petals covered the marble floor in elegant patterns, and additional security personnel stood at discreet positions around the building. Rebecca was the first to notice the motorcade arriving. 3 black Range Rovers with tinted windows, moving with the precise coordination that could only mean one thing: royalty was coming. Her hands trembled as she straightened her blazer and tried to make sense of what was happening. Preston arrived at his usual time, expecting another day of easy sales to wealthy clients with more money than automotive knowledge. Instead, he found his showroom filled with palace staff, security personnel, and an atmosphere of barely contained excitement that made his stomach clench with unnamed dread. "What's going on?" he demanded of Rebecca, who was too nervous to speak coherently. Before she could answer, the main doors opened, and Prince William stepped into the showroom. He moved with the easy confidence of someone born to public life, his smile genuine and warm. But it was the man beside him who made Preston's blood run cold. Corporal Tristan Beckford, still in his immaculate scarlet tunic, walked at the prince's right shoulder. His bearing was perfect, his expression neutral, but there was something in his eyes that suggested this was not going to be a typical royal visit. "Lovely eat tip," Prince William said cheerfully, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent showroom. "Though I hear you've met my expert." He gestured toward Beckford with obvious respect and familiarity. Preston felt his knees go weak. The tin soldier he had humiliated yesterday was standing next to the future King of England, being introduced as an expert. The implications crashed over him like a cold wave. Reginald Crownley, Preston's father and the dealership's owner, appeared as if summoned by the gravity of the situation. At 72, he had built his business through careful attention to detail and absolute respect for his customers. The idea that his son might have insulted someone with connections to the royal family made his heart race with panic. "Your Royal Highness," Reginald stammered, executing a perfect bow, despite his age. "This is an unexpected honor. How may we serve you?" Prince William's smile remained perfectly pleasant, but there was steel beneath the courtesy. "I understand there was some confusion yesterday about authenticity. Tristan mentioned the manifold was replaced, yet your specifications claim the car is fully original." The technical accuracy of the statement hung in the air like a sword. Preston realized with growing horror that everything he had dismissed as tourist nonsense was actually expert knowledge. The guard had known exactly what he was talking about. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding," Reginald said desperately, shooting a furious look at his son. "Oh, I don't think so," Prince William replied, his tone growing noticeably cooler. "You see, Tristan here has an excellent memory for detail. It's one of the qualities that makes him so valuable to us. He can recite conversations word for word, including the part where your son told him to complain to his prince." The prince's eyes fixed on Preston with the kind of attention that made grown men confess their sins. "Well, here I am." The silence that followed was deafening. Every person in the showroom held their breath, waiting to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve itself. What followed was a masterclass in dignity under pressure. Beckford, speaking in the same measured tone he had used the day before, recited Preston's insults verbatim. Every word, every sneer, every dismissive gesture was reproduced with perfect accuracy. The staff gasped. Sir Charles Wellington, who had returned to witness the confrontation, shook his head in disgust. Reginald Crownley's face went through several shades of red, before settling on a pale grey that suggested genuine fear. For his business's reputation, without hesitation, he forced his son to apologize, not just to Beckford, but to Prince William, to the uniform, to everything the guards represented. But the apology wasn't enough. In front of the prince, the staff, and several influential customers, Reginald fired his son on the spot. The humiliation was complete in public, a fitting end to Preston's arrogant behavior. "Corporal," Reginald said, pulling out the keys to the E-Type, "please accept this car at cost. It's the least we can do to make amends." But Beckford, surprised everyone, removing his white gloves with careful precision, he declined the offer. "No, thank you. But do send my grandfather's photograph to the real enthusiasts." As the royal party prepared to leave, Prince William paused at the door. "Some uniforms demand respect," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the showroom. "Others earn it every single day." The final image was perfect in its simplicity. Beckford stood at the palace gates that afternoon, back at his post, duty calling as always. A black E-Type drove slowly past Prince William at the wheel, raising his hand in a small wave of acknowledgement. For just a moment, the guard's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. The lesson was complete. Never judge a man by his uniform, by his station, or by your own assumptions. True worth comes from character, from knowledge earned through dedication, from the quiet dignity of service. Preston Crownley had learned that lesson the hard way, in front of the future King of England, in the most expensive and public manner possible, and somewhere in Yorkshire, in a small garage filled with tools and memories, the spirit of Thomas Beckford smiled with pride at his grandson's quiet victory.